Hello, everyone, and welcome to its language technology web seminar series. And yeah, my name is Oyer Lopez de la Calle, and I'm lecturer at the University of the Basque Country, and I do research at ISHA Research Group, and I'm a member of its center as well. So yeah, today is my pleasure that we are having Isabelle Augenstein. I think I'm pronouncing well your name, Isabelle?
Augenstein, almost.
Augenstein, sorry.
No problem.
Okay, and she's going to give a very interesting talk today. Okay, so before I introduce the speaker, yeah, I would like to point out that in the past, we already had some interesting talks as well in this series, and you can check them out in the web page of its, and as well in the YouTube channel. I think you can have all the access to the previous talks. Okay, and know that we will have more new and interesting talks in this webinar, as you can see in the screen. Okay, so yeah, let's introduce Isabelle. So she's a professor at the University of sorry, okay, problem with Copenhagen, where she heads the Copenhagen Natural Language Understanding Research Group, as well as the Natural Language Processing section. Okay, and she completed her PhD at the University of Sheffield and was a postdoctoral researcher at University College London. Okay, her primary research interests are fact-checking, low-resource learning, and explainability, which is, I guess, the topics that she will cover today, or some of them at least. Okay. Among her extensive research, I would say that she's very well known for the paper stance detection with bidirectional conditional encoding, published in MNLP 2016, which is one of, I think, or Rodrigo told me that at least, that which is one of the most cited paper in stance detection, and where she showed that conditioning the task. In this paper, she showed that the conditioning the task with the target topic improves significantly the results, especially in unsupervised and weakly supervised scenarios. I think it's very nice paper to read. So if you don't know that paper, I think you should check it out. Okay, and she currently holds a ERC starting grant on explainable and robust automatic fact checking, as well as Danish equivalent of that, which is DFF Sapir Old Research Leader Fellowship on learning to explain attitudes on social media. She is also a member of a young Royal Danish Academy of Science and Letters and vice president-elect of SIGDAT, which organizes the MNLP conference series. So that's my introduction of Isabelle. So yeah, Isabelle, the floor is yours, and you can start when you feel ready. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That EMNLP paper from 2016 feels ancient now. That was with bidirectional conditional encoding with
Yes.
LSTM and so on.
Yes.
I think some of the ideas behind it are still interesting and relevant. Yes, so I've now shared my screen. You have somehow, as the audience, disappeared, but let's. I suppose that's okay. I'll find you again later when we do the questions. Okay, no, I can see you now. You're on that screen. All right. So what I want to tell you about today is some of the research we've done that's related to fact checking, but somehow tries to go slightly beyond that. Because in fact checking, you just have black and white veracity if something is true or false, but there are actually many more different ways of different shades of truth and different tasks which are related to veracity, but are much more complicated and intricate. Specifically, one of the things we're looking at is science communication, where you have many different ways of communicating scientific findings by different stakeholders, scientists, journalists, and the general public. one of the reasons we're interested in this topic is because science communication really matters. The way that science is communicated matters because the general public picks up on that, and it affects their trust in science and also in future actions. One example I have for you here is an article in Nature that's called HIV Vaccine May Raise Risk. And that's an article that's based on a study with some, of course, some very specific group testing some very specific vaccine. And they find that that vaccine raises the risk of HIV, actually. And then there are different ways of framing that. One is the original way that's communicated in the Nature article. And then people might think, well, I can still maybe get a vaccine. But if it's communicated to say scientists have found that HIV vaccines have many side effects, then people might think it's not so safe to get an HIV vaccine. And then it has a direct impact on vaccine uptake. And we've seen a lot of that during COVID, of course. Now, the way it typically works is that scientists come up with some findings, and journalists then try to translate these findings to make them more understandable to the general public. And finally, the general public discusses these findings amongst peer groups. Now, the general public relies on journalists to learn scientific findings because it's difficult for the general public to understand scientific findings directly as communicated in papers. Even we as scientists find it difficult to understand scientific papers outside of our immediate discipline. And that also means that the perception of science is shaped by how journalists communicate science as opposed to by the science itself. Now, I found one study here, one survey here about science communication, consumption of science news by the general public. And that shows that the general public regularly gets their science news from broad news outlets, even though they agree that that particular source doesn't get the facts right a lot of the time, but that the more reliable source would be, for example, science magazines or so on. And again, that is because the general public lacks that domain-specific knowledge to critically evaluate science news coverage. Now, as part of that same survey, the general public was asked about the news media, how they communicate scientific findings, and they argue that the news media are very, very quick to report findings that may not hold up. You find that here in 43% of the cases. And also that the public doesn't understand enough about science to understand findings in the news and critically evaluate them. But also that news media often oversimplify scientific research findings, so not just simplify them to make them understandable, but make them too simple, and are also too quick to report on disagreements about findings. And that means that the public jumps to conclusions about how to apply new findings about research to their lives. And one example I find very interesting is all the coverage that is about just general food products, everyday food we consume, like eggs and tea and beef and so on. And there are lots of hyped up polarized news articles about them. So whenever there is a study that finds that some subgroup has a negative reaction to something, it ends up being covered by some news outlet as something along the lines of caffeine causes cancer or coffee cures cancer. And that then leads to uncertainty and erosion of trust in scientists. Whereas if you look at the actual picture, the actual underlying facts, you find that it's much more nuanced and complicated. So what I have here on the left-hand side is a meta-analysis of common cookbook ingredients with their relative extracted risk of cancer. And you can find that, well, lots of studies find that wine protects against cancer, but also some that it causes cancer. And you can see the spread here. And for some, it's more clear than for others. So for beef, for example, it mostly causes cancer, but some studies have also found that it protects against cancer. But this isn't how science is communicated to the general public. because it's often only a reporting of one specific scientific article. Now, how does it happen? How does this message change from something that's quite intricate to something that's polarized and oversimplified? I'll show you an example here. And this example is about magnesium. So we have the original message that says increasing dietary magnesium intake is associated with a reduced risk of stroke, heart failure, diabetes, and all-cause mortality. This is then covered by Reuters as the study findings suggest that increased consumption of magnesium-rich foods may have health benefits. And the general public on Twitter then turns that into magnesium saved lives. Now, this is an actual example that we also use in our data set. Why is that problematic? Let's break it down a little bit. The first problematic thing is that the independent variable, dietary magnesium intake, is being generalized to consumption of magnesium-rich foods to all magnesium. Then we have the strength of the claim, which changes from a correlational statement associated with to a conditional causal statement suggests may have to a causal statement on Twitter saves lives. And then lastly, we have the diseases in the finding being generalized. We have first a reduced risk of stroke, heart failure, diabetes, and all-cause mortality to health benefits to just saves lives. Now, when you look at that together, then the final message isn't necessarily false, but it's misleading and also inaccurate, and it leads to behavior change. So someone might read this and think, I better just take some magnesium every day because it will save my life. And this is a relatively harmless example. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily hurt people, but there are much more things that have a much bigger impact on people's lives, where it's much more serious than this. Now, there are two things that can be done. The one is to try to create a better news coverage, try to somehow better communicate with journalists as researchers, and make sure that the articles they put out are more accurate. It could be to also try to steer the discourse on social media and so on. And that's definitely something we should do as scientists. But I would say that it's an uphill battle because there are all sorts of different incentives out there. That means that journalists, they benefit from actually creating some overhyped news because they have a financial incentive to do so, to create more ad revenue and so on. The other thing that we can do is we can try to build tools and resources to automatically understand and analyze these changes in the context of science communication in order to then better understand the science communication process, which can then again help scientists who can put in the time to create faithful news coverage of scientific news. And yeah, the second one is the line of research we've been doing. Now, I also promised to talk a bit about fact-checking. And to do this, I first want to tell you a bit about how automatic fact-checking generally works to try to explain the relationship between modeling information change and automatic fact-checking. Now, you usually start off with some statement, such as magnesium saves lives from the previous example. And the first task then becomes claim checkworthiness detection, which is to say, is this first a claim or is it an opinion? And if it's a claim, is it checkworthy or not checkworthy? The next step is then usually evidence document retrieval and ranking, which means to try to retrieve evidence documents from, for example, Google Scholar or PubMed to say, how can we back this up? How can we verify this? The next step could then be called recognizing textual entailment, which is about taking this claim and taking an evidence document or a statement from an evidence document and try to see if this evidence document backs up the scientific claim, or if it's neutral towards it, or if it refutes it. And the last one is then, given all of these claim evidence pairs, to say what the final veracity is, if it's true, if it's false, or if there is not enough info. And of course, there can be other labels there as well. Now, the step that's related to this information change that we were looking at is the evidence ranking bit. So for the evidence ranking step, the notion of similarity really, really matters. So in most previous work, people have just looked at strict textual similarity, where they really just compare words, two different sequences, word by word. But what we propose is to not just look at the actual text, but at the information content in terms of the scientific claims. So you might have all kinds of other content in there. For example, the study findings suggest that, or researchers at the university of such and such have discussed something with journalists and so on. And the studies, they found then that dietary magnesium intake is associated with and such. And all of this additional information isn't really relevant to the claim itself, but taking the very strict notion of textual similarity, it would mean that the two pairs would be rated as being much less similar than if one were to just look at the difference between the scientific findings conveyed in the two sequences. I hope that makes sense, and I'll also show you some more examples of that later on. Now, what we want to measure also is the difference between claim evidence pairs, where the evidence can potentially come from different sources. So it can come from press releases or Twitter, whereas the claim can come from scientific articles. And most previous work actually just looked at two sequences from the same kind of domain with the same kind of text type, if that makes sense. Now that I've told you a bit about how this work is motivated and why we should care about science communication, there are two different experimental setups I want to go into a bit more. So the first study we did on this was to look at information change in a relatively constrained way, just looking at the problem of exaggeration. So detecting exaggeration, and to do this again in a constrained way by measuring the differences in the static causal relationships in two sentences. There we looked at just health science press releases. And then in the follow-up work, which I'll present afterwards, we looked at information change in communicating scientific findings more broadly, trying to go beyond just static causal relationships. And then also going beyond health science press releases by also looking into different scientific domains and also looking into tweets as one source of communicated science by non-scientists. And then I'll tell you a bit about what else we think could be done in this kind of domain. Now, starting with the exaggeration detection of science press releases, that's this setting here where we have the original scientific text and then we have the press release. And we want to predict the strength of the claim, changing from, for example, a correlational statement associated with to a conditionally causal statement in the news, such as suggests or may. Here, those would be the linguistic markers. Now, we're not the first to look at exaggeration in science journalism. There has been previous work on doing that. Specifically, these two papers here, Sumner et al. And Bratton et al., they looked at identifying the source of distortions, exaggerations, or changes in the main conclusions drawn from research that could then potentially influence a reader's health-related behavior. And these press releases that they looked into, they are press releases from Eureka Alert and from universities' websites. And I should say that they're very, very high quality. What they found when they analyzed them is that even in these extremely high quality press releases, which sometimes even contain interviews with the scientists themselves, 33% of them contain exaggerations of the conclusions of the scientific papers they report on. Now, this is extremely problematic, of course, and it's just one indication. And if one were to look at other press releases or we think at tweets, then this figure would just go up. Now, when they looked at causal claim strength prediction and some follow-up work looked at identifying linguistic cues related to that, there are 4 different categories that have been used: no relation, correlational, conditional causal, and direct causal. Now, sorry. We wanted to formalize this task of scientific exaggeration detection, building on this prior work, and also curate the data set to do this automatically, given as input a primary finding of the paper as written in the abstract and the press release, whereas previous work just looked at strength prediction from one input as opposed to paired input. And because there was relatively little work, we investigated some semi-supervised methods for doing that. And we used some early methods for exploiting large language models to do semi-supervised learning. So that was from 2021. We built on this method called pattern exploiting training. Now, we have 2 different task formulations. The first one, the most obvious one, is an entailment-like task where we have paired press release and abstract data. And we then want to say, does the press release downplay the abstract? Is it the same as in the abstract, or does it exaggerate the abstract? And then we have this causal claim strength prediction task. And that's the setup that previous work used. Just a text classification task given unpaired press releases and abstracts, and predicting then if it expresses these individual press releases and abstracts, they don't report on any relation. They report a correlational relation, a conditional causal relation, or a direct causal relation. If we know that the press release and the abstract reports on the same scientific finding, we can then combine these 2 to get a final prediction, which is then the same as the entailment-like prediction, if we compare the strength of the paired press release and the abstract. I hope that makes sense, and I'll also show you an example of that now. So first, a little bit in case you don't know this pattern exploiting training method here. As I said, it's one way of exploiting language models to do prediction other than just having a traditional classifier, which gives you a label between here, 0 and 3. So we would, in that case, take a pre-trained language model and then have a pattern such as the claim strength is. And then we would have this mask. And where we have this mask token, the language model would predict a token, a verbalizer, and each of these would correspond directly to one of the labels between 0 and 3. So 0 would correspond to medium, all the way up to distorted, which would be the label of 3 here. Now we have these, again, we have, sorry, I already said that we have these labels, and we have the large pre-trained language model, and we have the verbalizers over there. Now, to do all of that, we have to manually identify these types of verbalizers and how they correspond to these types of labels. And I'll show you some of the ones later on that we've defined just to illustrate this a little bit better. In terms of the modeling, given then these pattern verbalizer pairs, which we came up with, we train an ensemble of models on a small labeled C dataset to predict the appropriate verbalizers for these slots. And then we get some probability for each of these verbalizers, for example, 0.01 or 0.36 here for distorted. And here we have these different language models for each of these patterns. So given this ensemble of models trained on the large small seeds dataset, we predict the appropriate verbalizers that then apply to unlabeled data, and the raw logits are combined as a weighted average to predict soft labels for the unlabeled data. And we end up with these three language models, and we want to combine them somehow. And for that, KL divergence is used to produce the final classifier, to distill the final classifier. Now, what we do is we extend this to a multitask learning regime where we have the two different tasks we care about. The first one, again, is claim strength prediction, where we just have one sentence and we have the claim strength. And the other one is then this entailment-like task where we predict exaggeration directly. And for the entailment-like task, we have both the reporters and then on the other side, we have the scientists claim something, reporters claim something, and then we have the reporters claims are something, and that last thing is then entailment or neutral or contradiction here. And because we can pair these two, we can directly train them using one model, and then, as said, combine convert one task to the other later on, the claim strength prediction task to the entailment-like task. And for PET, it just means that we feed two different tasks, instances with the two different tasks into the models when we train them. And otherwise, it works in exactly the same type of way. Now, to illustrate a bit more how these patterns work, I have some of the patterns here, the 4 patterns we used. And as I said again, these are manually crafted. So we have the one I showed you on the slide: scientists claim something, reporters claim something, and the reporters' claims are something. And the last one is the mask that's predicted. And then we also have something like academic literature claims, and then something that claim, and then popular media claims something. So you can see there are different ways of framing this here. And you can see even more differences when we look at the verbalizers. So for some of them, we have quite a lot of verbalizers. For example, for downplays, we have preliminary, competing, uncertainties, whereas for same, we just have identical. Yeah. Now I have some results for that, for you as well. They won't come as much of a surprise given all of the hype around large language models in the last half year or so. But we can see that we get substantial improvements when using these large language models using pattern exploiting training, 10 points in F1 compared to just supervised learning using a small labeled data set. And further improvements when we use this multitask learning with 2 different tasks. And yeah, this demonstrates that there is a transfer of knowledge from claim strength prediction to exaggeration prediction, but also just that using large language models for this task is better than just using supervised learning. And we also have some learning curves, which we can show here. Now, we show that MT-PET, this multitask learning version, with just 200 samples, approaches the performance on supervised learning with 4,500 samples, so, as you can see here. And that we found really interesting to see there. Right. Now, that was it for exaggeration detection. I'll briefly mention exaggeration detection again later on. You'll see why. But now we wanted to look at how to model information change more broadly than just exaggeration, and also look at more different scientific domains, and also look at tweets and not just press releases. And this means that we have these 3 different ways of communicating scientific information, with the tweets being the 3rd way. Now, at a high level, what we propose is a general model of information change for scientific communication. We propose to measure the similarity of scientific findings as measured by 2 scientific sentences. The way we define a scientific finding is as a statement that describes a particular research output of a scientific study, which can be a result, it can be a conclusion, a product, or some other kind of research output. We define this information matching score, which produces a value between 1 and 5, depending on how similar the scientific findings are. And you can see an example here where we have one that's highly similar and one that's highly dissimilar. And the highly dissimilar one, you can see it's not even about magnesium as the example otherwise is, but it's about drone deliveries. Now, when the information matching score is 1 or 2, we see a substantial change to the degree that it's not even the same finding that's being reported on. Whereas if it's between 3 and 5, then it's the same scientific finding, with 5 being completely the same. Now, we also curate a data set, and we spend quite a bit of time doing that thoroughly. Some of you might have heard of Altmetric, which is an aggregator of scientific articles online and mentions of scientific articles in press releases and tweets. Now, we take the data from that aggregator and we parse the papers from that automatically to get the different sections as well. Now, that means we have different potential news and paper pairs, and also potential tweet and paper pairs. If we want to just pair each finding with each different sentence in a scientific paper or tweet, we end up with really millions of pairs. And not all of them would make sense to annotate, because if we were to annotate all of them, we would get disproportionately many, which are very dissimilar in terms of the information content. Now, because of this, we do some sampling. We want to do some sampling in a stratified manner. And we do that by starting with an existing model, a sentence BERT model, trained on a billion sentence pairs just for semantic textual similarity. And again, that's not the real task we want to address here, but it's at least some kind of approximation to help us sample the data in a more meaningful way. We then get the bucketed sample here. So this SBERT model produces a value between 0 and 1, and we do stratified sampling in these different increments. And we decide to sample over 2,000 pairs of news and paper, 2,400 news and paper pairs, and 1,200 tweet and paper pairs for annotation here. And I've said we also focus on different domains. So here we have computer science, medicine, biology, and psychology. We then show this to annotators, which are actually domain experts. We recruit them through Prolific. And that's something that's very, very important to do, because as we realized in early annotation studies we just did ourselves, it's very, very difficult for us as computer scientists to actually judge, for example, articles from medicine. So that's why it's important to have domain experts. In addition to these pairs, which are manually annotated, we also have so-called easy pairs, where we just take things at the extreme end, where the semantic textual similarity model predicted close to 0 and close to 1, and we call them kind of easy, easy matches or easy pairs, where it's completely different in terms of the information content. And the final data set we call spiced here. Now we have another example on this slide where it's just good to illustrate the difference between STS, semantic textual similarity, and spiced as we see it. And there we have this additional information that the semantic textual similarity model considers and factors in for the similarity judgment. So we have here on the left-hand side the original findings saying, our results suggest that most of the adult onset men began their antisocial activities during early childhood. And then on the right-hand side, what the reporters report on, saying that Beckley, who is in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke, said that the adult onset group, and so on and so on. So all of this additional information is being taken into account by the STS model. Whereas if we train a model based on spiced, we find that it's actually much more similar. All right. Now, another way to demonstrate that is actually to look at the average edit distance across the training set for different matching sentences. And what we do there is we compare spiced here in the middle, and then the different subsets of spiced for news and for tweets to semantic textual similarity dataset there, and then a natural language inference dataset. And for semantic textual similarity, the average normalized edit distance it's much lower, which means that the two sentences are much more similar, whereas for spiced, they're much more dissimilar, almost twice as dissimilar, if that the average edit distance is almost twice as high. So then we also did some benchmarking to look at to what degree can one do zero-shot transfer to spiced as well as fine-tuning on spiced. So zero-shot transfer from these related tasks, paraphrase detection, natural language inference, and also then fine-tuning on spiced using different base language models, mini-LM and MPNet, and also looking at different pre-trained language models, including ones for scientific texts. We look at SciBERT and CiteBERT, and then just plain Roberta. Now we have lots of examples in our in our paper. I'll just try to show you a few of them. We see here. So here we can see that if we measure the Pearson correlation on the held out test set, then SBERT does well in terms of zero-shot transfer. And we have the overall test set here, then the news one here, and the tweet one down here. All of the models are SBERT based, but we just have different data they are trained on. If we have scientific data here, it actually doesn't do it doesn't do as well as if we fine-tune them using fine-tune the models using mini-LM or MPNet. But still the scientific models are slightly better than plain mini-LM and MPNet. And we get really poor performance for just a paraphrasing model or a natural language inference model, which also shows you just how different these tasks are. Now, the real interesting thing I want to show you here, in my opinion, is zero-shot evidence retrieval performance, meaning does training on this SPICE dataset improve performance on scientific evidence retrieval for real-world scientific claims? And for that, we test on two different scientific fact-checking datasets. One is called Covert and one is called Covert Fact. And the Covert Fact, as the name already suggests, contains claims about COVID and is from Reddit, whereas the Covert dataset contains claims from Twitter and also contains other type of scientific claims, though also mostly in the domain of biomedicine. Now, starting with Covert, we see that there is a substantial improvement we can gain when we fine-tune the models compared to the base models. So that those are mini-LM and MPNet. And we also see that there are substantial improvements over just a lexical baseline. BM25 is the one we use here. And we see the same kinds of improvements when we look at Covert Fact, the other fact-checking dataset. And yeah, that's really, really encouraging. And it means that for fact-checking, for downstream fact-checking, it actually makes sense to train on a data set that measures the difference in information content as opposed to just semantic textual similarity. Now, the other interesting thing we could do once we have a model that's trained to detect information differences is to look at some research questions, which are more in the area of science communication. The first one we looked at here is, do findings reported by different types of media outlets actually express different degrees of information change from the respective papers? And the different media outlets we looked at were press releases, science and technology news, and general news outlets. we group the different outlets into these categories, and we get the information matching score, the predicted information matching score there. And we then fit a linear mixed effects regression model over 1 million of these matched news and paper pairs. But first, the overall thing we find is that, probably not very surprising, yes, there is a difference. And you can probably already guess what kind of difference it is. So general news outlets tend to be much less faithful to the findings covered in scientific documents than press releases or science and technology news. And we can actually measure the difference there because that's part of the input here. We can look at the information matching score. So there is a difference in 0.4 in information matching score between general news outlets and press releases, which is really quite a lot. Yes. The next research question we look at is, do different types of social media users systematically vary in information change when discussing scientific findings? And the different social media users we look at there is verified accounts versus not verified accounts, then different amount of followers and accounts following, also account age, and whether an account is an organizational account. We do the same thing otherwise, fit the same kind of model to it. Now, overall, we again find, yes, there is a difference. But what I want to say is that the difference is much less well pronounced. So the difference in information score is much smaller here. We do, though, find that the organizational Twitter accounts at the top here, they keep more original information from the paper finding, whereas verified accounts and having more followers means that the information content changes a lot more, which again is not that surprising. Now, the last research question we look at is which parts of a paper are more likely to be miscommunicated by the media. And for that, we don't only look at the information matching score, but, and that's where I get back to our previous paper, we get the information matching score, and then we automatically predict the exaggeration for the newspaper pairs, and we also predict the certainty communicated in the pair. So by certainty, it means that the certainty with which the finding is communicated. So it might be may versus does. That could be a difference in certainty. Now, we find that journalists tend to downplay the certainty and the strength of findings in abstracts. Whereas when it comes to findings, they are more likely to be exaggerated and overstated. The limitations are more likely to be exaggerated and overstated. And that's really problematic because the limitations are actually where we say, well, the findings, they don't hold as broadly, for example. So that also means that journalists might fail to report the limitations of scientific findings. And it means that only studying the abstracts of scientific documents is not enough. And the reason I say this is that most prior work on science, on studying scientific documents using NLP just looks at the abstracts because it's much easier to get a hold of abstracts than it is to get a hold of entire papers, because then they have to be parsed. Right, so that was mostly it. I'll wrap up now and also give you some perspectives for future research. The overall message I want to convey is that careful communication of science is very, very important because the general public relies on general news outlets for scientific news. And overhyping of science news erodes trust in scientists when it's chocolate cures cancer one day and chocolate causes cancer the next day. Or magnesium saves lives as well. when we have this type of overhyped claims and exaggerations of findings, they can lead to behavior change. The example I had there was about magnesium, saying that it can mean that some people maybe start taking magnesium every day just because it can have, they think it can save their lives. Now, what we proposed to automatically detect such changes in information content was a very broad model of information change, whereas prior work focused on semantic textual similarity. And we demonstrate that there is a difference between semantic textual similarity and spiced, both when we look at internal benchmarking and also when we apply it to the downstream task of fact-checking and more specifically evidence retrieval for scientific fact-checking. We find that also that there is a poor zero-shot performance of related tasks, such as paraphrasing and natural language inference. And this demonstrates the novelty of the task. The nice thing is that we propose a very diverse benchmark, which consists of 4 scientific domains and also 3 textual domains. And this means that it will be beneficial to scientific fact-checking and also other kinds of tasks going forward. And if you want to play around with it, you can find the model online, the dataset online, and there's also a package which you can very easily install using pip. We think it's a very interesting avenue for research that also opens the door to answering all kinds of new research questions about broad trends in science communication, such as here about what types of news outlets are more likely to exaggerate scientific findings. Now, we hope that in future work, other people will take this up and look at other types of other scenarios where measuring information change can actually be beneficial. And for example, use it as an auxiliary task for measuring selective reporting of findings in related work descriptions, or also for generative tasks, such as generating faithful summaries of scientific articles. We already know that there is selective reporting of science news in addition to overhyped reporting. So one thing to look at in future work could also be what factors affect journalists' selection of scientific findings in the first place. And this is something we're looking at right now. And these factors include societal relevance, economic implications, but also things such as entertainment value of the scientific finding. Now, in order to do all of this well, another thing that's needed is to look at what types of information change even exist. We, in our research, have looked at exaggeration, but there is also certainty and many other ways. And yeah, it's important to look at what there is and try to relate them to one another. Now, the last thing I want to say is just an acknowledgement of who else has been a part of this work. And Dustin and Jashin have been the drivers of this work, running all of the experiments there. And then David Jurgens has also been involved in the work and is our collaborator for the information change work and also some work going forward on scientific documents and looking at scientific communication more broadly. Yeah, so here are the papers in case you want to look them up. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions about it or want to talk about this offline as well. Thank you. And now I will try to see if I can get you on that other screen again so I can see you better. All right, here you are.
Okay, so thank you very much, Isabelle. Now it's time for the questions. So I think you can just open your mic and make questions. I guess it's the way we do. So, yep. Oh, okay. So you're raising your hand. So let's see, Martin. Let's.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hello. Thank you for your presentation. right now, I'm working since a few months on claim detection in scientific article, and actually this concept of what is a claim and what is not is highly discussed in the literature and in different fields. So yes. Maybe I missed it, but can you give a definition of what you consider is a claim in your work?
Yes, so I didn't put it on the slide. I think I just said it at some point. So we had the definition. I think I put it down in the notes somewhere. So I think we have the definition includes that the claim can refer to different things such as a result or a data set or so on. Let me see if I can find it again. I said it at some point. No, I don't have it here. So I don't remember the exact formulation. No, let's see. Okay. I'm sorry, I can't easily find it now, but it's in the paper.
Okay, I'm gonna read it then. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, I agree. It's very difficult how to even say what a claim is. And in some of the prior work we've done, we've also looked at decomposing claims into atomic claims. And then it's even more important to try to understand what a claim is, and differentiate that between claim versus opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so Tommaso, I think you were raising your hand, so if
yes,
you want to ask
thanks.
something.
Thanks for the talk. Really interesting and yeah, fascinating. I have a question. So this is all data-driven approaches, right? So
Yes.
in a way, do you think, to what extent, let's put it this way, not do you think, to what extent do you think that some form of symbolic reasoning could actually help within, not just, yeah, to maybe not to the entire task, but maybe to some aspect of the entire task that you were highlighting? So if there is the question is basically, do you think that there could be a role for these, or is something like maybe these data-driven approaches are actually pretty good, so let's stick to them?
Right. I think the data-driven approaches are relatively good, but one thing where let's say some more symbolic approaches would come in, I think, is when we're talking about scientific expert language somehow. So we, in our previous work, also looked at, different formulations of scientific concepts. So you have this thing on this slide, actually here you have, you have dietary magnesium and magnesium and so on, and then the different diseases and so this is at least where I could see some symbolic approach come in, where you say that something is maybe a concept and an instance of a concept, or however you want to define it in your symbolic approach. But yeah, I mean, here a stroke is a type of disease, heart failure is a type of disease, and so on. And then a reduced risk of heart failure is a type of health benefit, and so on. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so more questions? You can raise your hands and I can give you the voice. Okay, so yeah, I have a couple of questions, and then maybe they're more technical than the previous one. So where we were showing the empty TED model, I think was in exaggeration detection experiment. Okay, so I guess you told us that you were manually building the patterns, isn't it?
Yeah, these patterns here.
Yeah,
Yes.
those patterns. Yeah. So it just proves how important they are, how sensible they are, how the result change if you change the patterns of. Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's extremely sensitive to the patterns. We actually developed them somehow semi-automatically. The verbalizers are developed semi-automatically, whereas the patterns are written by hand. And we spent a lot of time looking at the patterns, and the most stable approach we then found is to average over the patterns and the verbalizers. So when we get the lodges at the end, to just average over them, and that makes it more stable. But otherwise, it's very sensitive to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this could be problematic if you want to move to different domains and or tasks, I guess.
Yeah, I think the only way around is really to use several different
Yeah.
verbalizers, several different patterns, because then it becomes stable.
Yeah, and the experiments that you were showing, they were using they were running on a few shot scenario, or
Yes, exactly.
could you show us again the curve, the learning curve that you were showing? I think,
Yeah.
So why, maybe I missed something. So why the empty pet curve is straight? Because I guess the x axis is the number of examples you have for training.
Yeah, so here we just have an example with one set of with the same number of training instances here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
No problem. I can also, I think I have somewhere in the appendix how many examples we actually had for that, if you're interested in that. So we have yeah, we have really very few examples. We have just 100 for label entailment, and then 5,000 something for claim strength detection, from which we then sample 4,500 and so on. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have time for one question. So in the chat, I don't know if you have access to the chat, Isabelle? No, also I can. I mean, can you talk or use the mic? Maybe it's easier. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah, I can talk. Thank you. Well, my
Okay.
question is, how much do you think the developed approach could be used to check facts with respect to other domains, not necessarily scientific, like political, or maybe for fake news? Like, do you envision that? How much is that would be applicable in that case?
So you mean the this thing about information?
Yeah, information change, model information change.
Yeah, I think it could also be applied to other domains. But yeah, I mean, here we just looked at scientific documents, but of course with politics you have the same thing, that someone says something and then it's miscommunicated. So yeah, absolutely. But it's just more maybe less obvious what the original source is. I mean, here it's very clear that we have the scientific documents and then they're communicated. Whereas with politics, the question is what the original source is. Maybe you would have some party manifestos, or maybe you would have some politician saying something, and then that's the original source. So yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so more questions? The last one? No? Okay, so I think it's time to finish the webinar, because we finished at 4, I think. So yeah, thank you, Isabelle, again for your interesting talk, and yeah, see you around.
Thank you for inviting me. Bye for now.
Thank you very much.